Consider for a moment how you speak to yourself, not the curated inner voice that makes sensible plans and reasonable assessments. The other one, the one that arrives when you have made a mistake, or when you look in the mirror at the wrong angle, or when something you attempted did not go the way you needed it to. The voice that says things to you about your competence, your worth, your body, your future, that you would never, in your most careless moment, say to another person you cared about. Most people have a better relationship with their colleagues than with themselves. More patience, more charity, more willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt, more instinct to meet difficulty with encouragement rather than with condemnation. The standards they apply to their own experience are standards they would consider cruel if applied to someone they loved. And yet they apply them automatically, fluently, with considerable creativity and persistence, to the one person who will be with them every moment of every day for the rest of their lives. The relationship between you and you is the most consequential relationship in your life. Not because other relationships do not matter, they matter enormously, but because every relationship you have with another person is filtered through this one. The way you allow yourself to be treated, the standards you accept, the quality of connection you believe you deserve, all of these are determined, before the other person enters the picture, by the relationship you have established with yourself. And most people have never consciously cultivated that relationship at all. Part 1. The inner critic as inner relationship. The voice of the inner critic is not simply a thought. It is the voice of a relationship, a specific, ongoing, dynamic relationship between the part of you that judges and the part of you that is judged. And like all relationships, it has a history, a set of implicit rules, a pattern of interaction that has been established over time, and that operates automatically in the way that all deeply ingrained relationship patterns operate faster than conscious thought, in the space before deliberate choice. The inner critic learned its role from the external critics of the developmental environment, the parent whose standards were high and whose disappointment was visible, the teacher whose commentary on failure was more memorable than their commentary on success, the peer group whose approval required a continuous management of one's presentation, the cultural messages about what bodies, achievements, and life trajectories should look like that arrived through every available channel. All of these were eventually internalized, taken inside and converted from the voices of external others into the apparently internal voice of the self's own assessment. But it is not the self's own assessment. This is the critical misunderstanding that keeps the inner-critic relationship in place. The inner critic is not the voice of honest self-evaluation. It is the voice of someone else's standards and someone else's fear, speaking through the channel of your own interior. When it says you are not good enough, it is not reporting an assessment made by the deep, wise, genuinely self-knowing part of you. It is reporting the assessment of an early environment that applied standards to you before you had the capacity to question their validity or their authority over your sense of yourself. The psychologist Paul Gilbert, drawing on evolutionary psychology and clinical research, describes the inner critic as the activation of the threat system, the same neural system that responds to external danger, turned inward against the self. The harsh self-criticism is experienced by the nervous system as threat, and the nervous system responds to it exactly as it responds to external threat, with the full physiological mobilization of the fight-or-flight response, including the cortisol flooding, the narrowed cognitive focus, and the suppression of the social engagement system that is also, crucially, the system through which genuine care and connection, including self-care and self-compassion, are experienced. The inner critic does not only make you feel bad, it physically prevents the experience of the antidote to feeling bad. The alternative is not the elimination of self-assessment. Accurate self-knowledge, the honest, clear-eyed assessment of one's capacities, values, and choices, is genuinely valuable and serves genuine growth. The alternative to the inner critic is not the inner cheerleader who endorses everything and evaluates nothing. It is the inner coach, The voice that can look honestly at what went wrong, identify what needs to change, and communicate that assessment in the quality of language that actually produces growth rather than the quality of language that produces shame and contraction. The inner coach speaks from a position of genuine care for the person it is coaching. It is interested in the person's growth, not in the administration of a verdict. It can say this did not work and here is why and here is what would work differently, without the additional message that the failure reveals something permanent and definitive about the person's worth. This quality of speaking, honest, caring, oriented toward growth rather than toward condemnation, is available in the internal relationship as in any other, and cultivating it is among the most direct and most consequential things you can do for every other aspect of your life. Part 2. How you treat yourself, determines how you allow others to treat you. The standards you apply to the relationship between yourself, and you set the floor for the standards you will accept in relationships with others. Not perfectly. There are relationships in which people accept treatment far below the standard they would apply to themselves, and relationships in which they demand treatment far above it. But as a general principle, the quality of the internal relationship creates a baseline below which the nervous system becomes too uncomfortable to function, and a ceiling above which the internal relationship does not believe it is entitled to reach. The person who speaks to themselves primarily in the language of inadequacy and criticism will often find that they attract, accept, or remain in relationships in which they are spoken to similarly. Not because they deserve it, but because the familiar register feels, to the nervous system, like home. The person who speaks to themselves with consistent disrespect will frequently find that they tolerate consistent disrespect from others, not because they lack the capacity to recognize it, but because the tolerance of it is consistent with the implicit standard that the internal relationship has established. The psychologist John Bowlby, whose attachment theory we have examined in other contexts, described the internal working model, the unconscious representation of the self in relationship with others, as the primary determinant of what the person expects and accepts in their close relationships. The internal working model is formed by the early relational environment and refined through subsequent experience. But it is also shaped, continuously, by the quality of the relationship the person maintains with themselves, by the degree to which the internal voice models the respect, care, and honesty that they hope to find in their external relationships. The therapist and author Nathaniel Branden, whose lifelong work on self-esteem produced some of the most careful philosophical treatments of the subject available, argued that self-esteem is not simply a feeling, it is a judgment, a specific judgment about the fundamental adequacy of the self for the challenges of living. And this judgment, he found, was the single most powerful determinant of what people pursued, what they accepted, and what they believed they were entitled to in every domain of their lives. The person whose judgment of their own adequacy is high pursues ambitious goals, sets demanding standards in relationships, and declines treatment that falls below those standards without excessive internal conflict. The person whose judgment is low accepts less, pursues less, and experiences excessive internal conflict when asked to claim more than their internal standard has authorized. Branden identified what he called the 6 pillars of self-esteem, the specific practices through which the inner relationship is cultivated, and the judgment of self-adequacy is earned rather than simply affirmed. Living consciously, the commitment to honest self-awareness rather than the comfortable avoidance of difficult truths about oneself. Self-acceptance, the acknowledgement of who one actually is, including the imperfections, without making the imperfections the primary focus of the self-assessment. Self-responsibility, the claiming of genuine agency rather than the externalization of the causes of one's circumstances. Self-assertiveness, the expression of genuine values, needs, and perspectives in the interactions of daily life. Living purposefully, the direction of one's capacities toward genuinely chosen goals. Personal integrity, the alignment between one's stated values and one's actual behavior. Each of these pillars is a practice within the internal relationship. Each of them strengthens the foundational judgment of self-adequacy that determines what the person believes they deserve and what they will accept from the external relationships of their life. The cultivation of the inner relationship is not a retreat from the external world. It is the development of the internal resource from which genuine external relationships, genuinely mutual, genuinely respectful, genuinely worthy of the person inhabiting them, become possible. Part 3. Self-respect as practice. Self-respect is not a feeling that arrives when you have finally achieved enough to justify it. If you are waiting to feel self-respect before you practice it, you will be waiting indefinitely. Because the feeling of self-respect is produced by the practice of self-respecting behavior, not the other way around. The action precedes the feeling. The behavior constructs the internal sense. The practice of treating yourself as someone whose needs are real and worth meeting, whose perspective is valid and worth expressing, whose time and energy are finite resources that deserve to be directed toward things that genuinely matter. This practice is what produces, over time, the felt sense of self-respect that most people are waiting to simply have. Self-respecting behavior is specific. It is the decision, made in the ordinary moments of ordinary days, to treat your own needs as genuine information rather than inconvenient obstacles to the accommodation of others. To spend your time and energy on things that align with your actual values, rather than on things that produce only the appearance of productivity or the approval of people whose opinion you have decided to need. To express your genuine perspective in conversations where it is relevant, even when the expression carries the risk of disagreement. To decline requests that conflict with genuine priorities rather than accepting everything, and then resenting the acceptance. The psychologist and researcher Brené Brown describes what she calls wholehearted living, the quality of engagement with life that comes from the foundation of the belief in one's own worthiness. She identifies self-compassion, the practice of treating oneself with the same warmth and understanding one would offer a good friend, as the most important component of this worthiness, not the performance of self-care. The genuine, felt, regularly practiced experience of meeting one's own difficulty with kindness rather than with criticism. The ancient philosophical tradition of eudaimonia, the Greek concept of flourishing that Aristotle placed at the center of his ethics, is directly relevant here. Eudaimonia is sometimes translated as happiness, but is more accurately described as the full, active expression of one's capacities in accordance with one's deepest values. It is not a feeling that arrives from external conditions. It is an activity, the specific activity of living in accordance with what one genuinely is and what one genuinely values. Self-respect is the foundation of eudaimonia, because the person who does not respect themselves has not yet given themselves permission to take their own values and capacities seriously enough to actually live from them. The specific practices of self-respect are not grand gestures. They are daily, small, ordinary decisions that, accumulated, constitute a relationship with oneself that the nervous system can rely on. The commitment to honesty with oneself, the refusal to maintain the convenient fictions that avoid the confrontation with aspects of the self or the situation that require attention. The commitment to genuine rest rather than only the performance of rest while continuing to be available to everything else. The commitment to the nourishment, physical, relational, creative, spiritual, that the specific person you are requires, even when the provision of that nourishment requires the assertion of needs that others would prefer you not have. Self-respect is not selfishness. This conflation is one of the most damaging confusions available, and it is particularly common in people who were taught, early and thoroughly, that self-prioritization is evidence of a deficiency of care for others. Genuine self-respect, The honest valuing of one's own needs, perspectives, and capacities is not in competition with the genuine respect of others. It is the prerequisite for it. The person who does not respect themselves cannot, ultimately, offer genuine respect to others, because genuine respect requires the capacity to see the other person as equally real and equally worthy, and that capacity requires the prior experience of having treated oneself as real and worthy in the first place. Part 4. The things you have been saying to yourself. There is a conversation that has been running in your interior life for as long as you can remember. It is so constant that you may have stopped experiencing it as a conversation. It may have become simply the background radiation of your experience of yourself, the atmosphere through which all other experience passes. But it is a conversation. And it is having an effect on the quality of your inner life, on the choices you make, on the relationships you allow, on the version of yourself that shows up in the world. That is as real and as consequential as the effect of any external relationship. What are you actually saying to yourself? Not the polite version, the version that would not embarrass you if it were made audible, the actual running commentary, the assessments of your body, your intelligence, your likability, your performance, your prospects, the comparisons with other people that almost always conclude in your disadvantage, the rehearsals of things that went wrong and the verdicts they are used to support, the predictions about how future attempts will fail based on the accumulated evidence of past ones, the specific, sometimes devastating things you say to yourself in the private aftermath of the public performances of your life. The clinical psychologist Stephen Hayes, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, uses the concept of cognitive diffusion to describe the practice of separating the self from the thoughts the self is having. The thought "I am inadequate" is different from the experience of having the thought "my mind is producing the thought that I am inadequate." The first fuses the self with the assessment. The second creates a small but significant space between the self and the content of the inner voice, the space in which the assessment can be examined rather than simply experienced as the truth. The mindfulness tradition describes this as witnessing, the capacity to observe the contents of consciousness, including the self-critical thoughts, from the vantage point of the awareness that is aware of them rather than from the position of identification with them. The witnessing awareness is not the thought. It is not the assessment. It is the knowing of the thought, the awareness of the assessment, and as such, it is always, by definition, larger than whatever it is observing. The self that is capable of witnessing the inner critic is not the same self that the inner critic is criticizing. It is the observer, and the observer, once found, provides a perspective that the criticism-identified self never has. The shift from the criticism-identified self to the witnessing self does not happen once and stay. It requires the repeated, patient practice of catching the inner critical voice, nomming it as a voice rather than a truth, and returning to the wider awareness that is capable of holding it without being entirely defined by it. This practice is the core of every form of meditation and mindfulness that has produced documented therapeutic benefits. It is also the core of the self-respect practice in its most fundamental form, the refusal to mistake the voice of the early environment for the truth of who you are. What you have been saying to yourself has been shaping you. The assessment you have been running has been determining what you attempt, what you accept, and what you believe is possible for someone like you. Changing that assessment does not require pretending the inner critic does not exist or that its concerns are entirely baseless. It requires the honest examination of where the critic came from, what it is protecting, and whether the verdict it is administering is actually accurate, actually proportionate, and actually serving the growth of the person it is addressing, or simply perpetuating the standards of an environment that no longer has authority over who you are allowed to be. Part 5. Building the relationship that changes everything. The relationship between you and you is built in the same way that all relationships are built. through the accumulated evidence of how you behave in it, not through declarations, through actions, through the daily, ordinary decisions that either confirm or contradict the implicit message about your own worth, through the quality of the attention you bring to your own experience, through the honesty you maintain with your own interior life, through the care you extend to your own needs, through the respect you embody in the choices you make on behalf of the person who will have to live with those choices. The first building practice is the commitment to internal honesty. The relationship between you and you cannot be genuine if it is organized around the maintenance of convenient fictions. The honest acknowledgement of what is working and what is not in your life, of what genuinely aligns with your values and what does not, of what you genuinely feel and need as distinct from what you have decided is appropriate to feel and need. This honesty is the foundation. Not the brutal honesty of the inner critic, which is honest about limitations and silent about strengths. The balanced honesty of the genuine self-witness, who sees what is there without amplification in either direction. The second practice is the deliberate cultivation of what the psychologist Martin Seligman calls character strengths, the genuine, specific capacities that are most authentically yours, most energizing when used, most aligned with the person you are at your best, not the strengths you think you should have. The ones that, when you are using them, produce the specific quality of aliveness and rightness that genuine strength use produces. The relationship between you and you is deepened by the honest identification and regular deployment of these strengths, because each deployment is evidence, added to the record, that the person you are is genuinely capable and genuinely valuable in ways that the inner critic's assessment never fully captures. The writer and teacher Pema Chodron describes what she calls maitri, an ancient Sanskrit concept typically translated as loving kindness toward oneself, as the unconditional friendliness toward oneself that is the foundation of all genuine compassion, not the performance of friendliness. The actual, practiced, daily quality of turning toward one's own experience, including the difficult parts, the shameful parts, the parts that do not match the image one would prefer to project, with the same warmth and interest one would bring to a dear friend describing a difficult experience. This maitri is not indulgence. It does not endorse everything or require the abandonment of honest self-assessment. It is the tone in which the self is held, the quality of the ground on which everything else, including the honest assessment and the genuine growth, rests. The relationship between you and you, built through these practices, internal honesty, the use of genuine strengths, the daily cultivation of maitri, becomes, over time, the most reliable relationship in your life. Not because it is perfect, because it is genuinely yours, because it is not dependent on another person's availability or responsiveness or capacity to understand. Because it is always there, in the ordinary moments of the ordinary days, providing the specific quality of recognition and care that every human being requires, and that no external relationship can provide as consistently, as intimately, or as unconditionally as the relationship you have with yourself, when that relationship is genuinely cultivated. Everything you have been hopping to find in another person is also available inside this relationship, not instead of what others can provide. Those things are genuinely irreplaceable, but as the foundation that makes what others provide receivable. The person who has a genuine, respectful, honest relationship with themselves is the person who can receive love without losing themselves in it, offer care without depleting themselves in the offering, occupy the full complexity of their own experience without either suppressing it or being overwhelmed by it. That person is available for the genuine external relationships of a genuine life. And the building of that person begins here, in the most private, most consequential, most entirely voluntary relationship available to any human being,